The story goes that after one issue of Batman, Bill Finger, the writer, and Bob Kane, the artist of the Batman saga, were troubled that Batman didn't have anybody to talk to.
When Bob Kane first got the idea for Batman, he conceived of him as a lone vigilante. And Bill Finger, of course, was writing the stories and the dialogue, and he kept finding that it was very hard to write dialogue for a character that was a solo character.
Well, you didn't even have thought balloons much in comics in those days. And the idea of interior monologue, whether in thought balloon or in a sort of voiceover kind of caption narration, the way we do it more often these days, was very infrequent. Normally you spoke only when you spoke. And in Batman's case, that wasn't very often.
And what's interesting with Batman is the master detective, how he figures things out. If he has no one to explain this to, it gets really odd, and it's all in his head and it becomes less impressive.
I mean, you had other characters for Batman to get exposition out through, whether it was a relationship with Alfred later on or Commissioner Gordon, but those are different type of relationships and they can only go so far. If the two people are sharing an adventure together, there can be a lot more discussion about how the events are unfolding or what the thought process are in regards to what they're doing.
And what happens next intrigues me as someone who loves mythology and psychology. Kane has to think of somebody for Batman to talk to. And what happens in his imagination is that he goes back into his own youth, and he seems to recall going to the matinee movies and watching Douglas Fairbanks Sr. in movies like The Pirate and Robin Hood, and fantasizing that he is in the movie with Douglas Fairbanks. He's kind of the sidekick to this great hero. And so naturally he trusts this impulse that the hero has someone there beside him.
So they had to give this character a name, and the name was Robin.
The story of Robin evolves over the years, and you really don't have a full, detailed origin of the character till the mid-60s. The essence of the tale always was the setting of the circus, the parents that were the flying Graysons, family of acrobats. Dick was a budding young acrobat, which helped justify later what he did in action with Batman. And someone comes and begins threatening the circus if they don't get protection money. And when not paid the protection money, ends up killing the Graysons. And Dick survives.
Dick Grayson's origin is very similar to Batman's in that, you know, it's the loss of parents. It's kind of a key theme that runs through all the Robins. You know, so in that, it makes it very easy to see why Batman would take on this young child, because he sees himself inside of him.
The parallelism that they wanted to develop about Robin's origin was to again have a fairly young person go through the tragedy of losing their family. The difference in the case of Robin is that he was old enough to sort of have a more developed consciousness about it and to do something about it and to be involved in the process of finding the killer.
He's not as obsessed. He can never be as obsessed as Bruce Wayne is.
To be realistic, there is a very big difference between having your parents gunned down in front of you in the streets and then having them plunge to their deaths as trapeze artists, because that's what they live with every day. The danger that they lived with every day, every time they went up there to the wires, that they might fall, because they worked without a net. So I didn't think it was something beyond Dick Grayson's comprehension that his parents might someday fall to their death.
I think you react differently to any particular tragedy or stimulus at different ages. If your parents were murdered in front of you while you were 2 years old, you probably wouldn't comprehend what was going on. And undoubtedly you'd grow up with some psychological burden because your parents wouldn't be part of your life, but the moment wouldn't be that critical. If you're 8, the way Bruce Wayne was portrayed, you're old enough to get it, you're old enough to understand, and you're fundamentally very helpless. And I think that helplessness creates an extraordinary level of anger. Because Dick Grayson goes through that trauma at perhaps 15, perhaps 16. At some level, the tragedy is taking place at the moment when you're already supposed to be leaving the nest. And it's just accelerating a process.
Mythically and dramatically, the only way that you can create a character who's going to transcend this urge for vengeance is by instilling in these characters a moment of compassion, of hope in early childhood.
For Dick, it was just over and done with. You know, vengeance has been had, and quickly, justice was served. So I think from his inception, he was able to see that this works, that we as the good guys can put away the bad guys.
It was one of the most brilliant masterstrokes I think anyone ever came up with, because what it did instantly was to humanize Batman. There is a factor and an element of him. He is obsessive, he is relentless, and he can be really inhuman. Robin serves the reminder factor. You remind him that who he is doing this for. Not just for revenge, not just to get the people who killed his parents, but to save the people like Robin, to save the human beings.
Pop psychologists would make the argument that there's only a handful of very fundamental relationships people recognize. Either a parent-child mode, or a child-parent mode, or a peer-to-peer mode. These are sort of the natural relationships we're programmed for.
Well, if you're going to play up the father-son relationship, even a teacher-student relationship, or even a generational relationship, or even the fact that one person is intensely driven and the other one is a little more of a free spirit, there's going to have to be conflict between the two characters. There's going to have to be two different points of view.
Batman was significantly older, than Robin, so that is the natural relationship that's going to develop. Teacher and mentee, father and son.
The way Bill Finger describes it was that he was writing a big brother relationship rather than a father and son. But I think the father and son relationship crept in there as well. So there was a tension between Batman being a father figure and being a big brother figure.
Bob Kane had uncanny insight into the psychology of kids. It's a fascinating phrase, the fatherly big brother who will now take care of him and show him how to become a man. And in this process of the mentorship, the kid is completely free. It's the dream of all young teens.
It all comes from you think knights and I guess they're squires, and how they'd follow the knights, they'd help them, and they'd eventually they grow into their own, and that's where the father-son relationship might be a little softer, whereas the mentor relationship definitely is pushing for results.
It's a timeless story. It's something that every person experiences. You can see a lot of yourself in these characters, or what you wanted yourself to be in those characters. So I think as a reader, those are the things you can identify with and follow along simply.
Later, when we were worried about logic, we made him maybe the big brother you wouldn't have wanted except when you needed help. A tough love kind of character.
It was both an idealization and a normalization, and I think worked effectively on both levels.
This notion of Batman and Robin working in tandem is an ancient one. We've had this idea of bringing heroes together, from Jacob and Esau in the Old Testament to Romulus and Remus as the Roman heroes, Castor and Pollux, on some level Odysseus and Achilles. So what does this say? What's important is that they're each learning from each other, which is what we get in this wonderful tandem story of Batman and Robin.
The sidekick to the master detective, it's goes back to Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. It's the Lone Ranger and Tonto. It is student and teacher.
The Holmes-Watson relationship is one of the paradigms of detective fiction. Can you bring in a character who's smart enough to have a theory, but not smart enough to have the right theory? And then have the great detective raise his hand and say, ah, but if only you had considered that that clay could only come from that particular fuller's wheel, then you would have known, Watson.
It's very pleasing. We have a need for somebody who's a little smarter than we are. So that was another way of dealing with the Batman-Robin relationship. Mentor-student rather than father-son, and in some ways a more logical iteration of that, and certainly the one that I like the best.
Both characters are interested in justice, but if you had to weigh one against the other, Batman's still got vengeance predominantly in his mind, and Robin really just wants to bring the guys who did the wrong to justice. He's not out to get them as opposed to out to stop them, and I think it's a difference.
The costume that Bob Kane decided on for Robin was very mythically inflected. He went to the artwork that emerged out of the whole mythology of Robin Hood, and he took the tunic and the cape and the shoes. And then the colors, again, are very significant. The red and the green. The red is the symbol of freedom, the freedom of the bird in flight. Robin is a bird in flight. He's a gymnast. He's a brilliant gymnast, the only one who can do a quadruple somersault.
The costume isn't interesting because it does evoke Robin Hood to some degree. The red vest, of course, allows Robin Redbreast, and usually part of his name. So it works on two levels, as Robin Redbreast, as Robin Hood.
The only real inspirations I see are the fact that they went with a much brighter color palette, and I always looked at it as something to be offsetting what Batman's color was. So therefore there was a real clear differentiation between the two. And it also made a very clear statement that he was not just another Batman, but a character into his own right.
They gave him sort of a medieval look, almost with chainmail pants, and then Jerry gave him a R insignia. So this was his sort of medieval calligraphy. It changed the whole tenor of the strip and brightened it up.
It's a very unusual and almost seemingly illogical choice to take a primary superhero who is dark and mysterious as the night and then give him a sidekick who's practically a living target.
There's another fascinating aspect to the costumes of both Batman and Robin, and that is the mask. The mask is an ancient motif. It's universal. It describes what can happen in ritual and ceremonies in which you need to go into another world, into an underworld, which is purely comic book territory as well. You need to wear a mask to conceal your true identity. Also to seek a kind of protection against anything malevolent that could happen to you in this afterworld. Why sacrifice your personal life? Why sacrifice a love, which happens again and again in these stories? Why sacrifice your personal safety?
Well, pulp characters sometimes use domino masks. What's also interesting is that Batman initially, the way Bob Kane initially created him, had a domino mask. So I don't know whether unconsciously they had that in their mind that Robin might, as Batman's protege, wear the mask that Batman lost when he got the cowl.
To look at the stories this way gives it a whole nother engine. These are two people who are hiding. They are masquerading through a good period of their lives. Why are they doing this? Because they feel there's a greater good at stake here. And the greater good is that they make atonement for the tragedy that happened when they were young.
Robin growing up in comics was a very rare thing. It still doesn't really happen. There was a handful of characters within the DC universe that I still know the story behind where anyone sort of fired the gun off and said, we're going to allow them to grow old.
Well, for a time, we sent him off to college. We figured this kid has spent enough time. Who does he think he is? Peter Parker? How long is it going to take him to get out of high school? So we invented a Gotham City equivalent, I guess, of Columbia, and sent him there, and that left him available for plot purposes. And yet it was logical that he was not always at Bruce Wayne's, our Batman's, side.
Now, we have this big debate within comics that Dick Grayson, who is sometimes at odds with Batman because he knows they're different, doesn't really want to become Batman. In a way, it's the fight that a father has with the son that this is your life. This is not my mantle. This is not what I'm going to become.
It organically turns into that because that's just what that mentor relationship does. It's passing the torch. It's passing knowledge down to the next generation.
Okay, I'm done being your kid's sidekick. That was a great job. You taught me everything I needed to know. I need to go be my own person now. And Robin the boy wonder isn't, I'm not going to be the Robin the man wonder. That's not going to work.
I think you're bound to, when you have two people that spend enough time together, you're bound to have conflict in between them, especially someone growing up. I mean, it goes back to the father-son motif of Batman and Robin, that, eventually the son, grows away from the ideas of the father, and or becomes an evolution of that. And that's what Robin becomes.
When you look back on any of the comics over the years, they both mirror what goes on in society and help create the change in society. It's the function of popular culture. If you think about how kids were viewed in 1940 when Robin was created, we were still really at the stage that kids should be seen and not heard. And then by the time you start seeing the late 60s stories, kids are saying, don't trust anyone over 30. Don't trust your parents. Your parents got us into this mess. We've got to get us out of this mess.
And in a sort of legendary moment in comics, he stripped his costume and gave up being Robin. And for a real brief period of time, he said, I don't know what we'll become next. And there was a handful of comics where Dick Grayson was just Dick Grayson.
As long as Dick Grayson was Robin, he was always part of a team, Batman and Robin. It was very hard for Robin to establish, Dick Grayson as Robin, to establish himself in his own right.
Batman is the soldier, and now Robin is the recruit, who I think Batman always eventually assumed. Sometime I'm going to die, probably not of old age, and someone should take over this fight. And it will be Dick. This will be his job. Until he finally did it and put on the costume of Nightwing. And Nightwing is who he became.
The decision to alter Robin to Nightwing was a culmination of several years of stories that were treating Robin with more mature themes.
As a fan, I actually enjoyed that moment because as a fan, I was growing up with the character. And I felt myself changing, and it's fun to watch a character actually change with us.
His stories were more independent of Batman, and the things that perhaps made him a perfect complement to Batman weren't working the same way.
Characters never really move. Sometimes they move off on their own, but they don't abandon the identity that they had as a kid to become a whole other character.
If you look at a hero, a lot of heroic behavior is compensation. All heroes are wounded and incomplete. A hero is an incomplete character. A hero is someone who is stuck. And how do you get unstuck? You go on a journey, you take on an adventure, and you need to be challenged.
So by doing that, that forced part of the maturation of Dick Grayson, by moving him away from Bruce Wayne, and that's where you start to see the change over.
This was also an important motif in World War II when servicemen were having to become their own fathers. They have to raise themselves quickly up to do things that would be difficult for full-blown adults who had a lot of experience and a lot of maturity under their belts. Both things are going on in the Batman and Robin mythology.
For the most part, the rule of thumb in writing is that people respond best to an aspirational character. So to give him a full feeling of independence, to give him a full feeling of storytelling, by changing the visual to Nightwing, if you didn't know it was Dick Grayson, you didn't bring that immediate baggage to mind. And even if you did know, it sort of filed away the knowledge a little further back so that you could approach the character fresh as he was being presented in that context.
Again, it comes back to Batman being this agent of vengeance. That's not Dick Grayson. He's much more a person who lives in the world. He's generally a happier person. And in that, I think that happier person is Nightwing. And in a sense, Nightwing was the stepping stone for him eventually becoming Batman. So go back and forth between that. Will Dick become Batman? Is it his? Has he become something else completely?